Doctor Strange has been very busy in his short time in the MCU so far, and with him continuing to mess with forces that he can't control, we're gonna look at his little portion of the grander Marvel universe in the comics and see just how much of it lines up. Spoilers, not really a lot. So the biggest change, or rather change through omission, is exactly where Marvel's favorite Sorcerer Supreme gets his powers from. In the movie, we only get a vague overview of magic and how it works. I get a little more in depth on this video here, and the only mention of the Vishanti in the MCU so far came from an episode of What If, so, you know, not very helpful. In the comics, the Vishanti is this group of 3 magical godlike entities who defend the Earth by giving one person the power of the Sorcerer Supreme. And this is where you'll sometimes hear comic fans talking about the difference between classic Strange and modern Strange. Classic Strange was crazy strong, probably too strong, which is why Marvel wanted to rein him in a bit. So when the Vishanti were fighting their evil counterparts, as you do, they called on Strange to help, but when they told him he would be leaving Earth for several millennia, aka a very long time, he told them no, and so in return, they took all of his Sorcerer Supreme powers away. He was still able to use basic spells, but he was nowhere near as powerful. With the MCU shying away from extra-dimensional and universal power structures for most of its time, it makes sense that they weren't rolled in, but with Multiverse of Madness, maybe we might finally get to see them. I mean, we already have another cool group showing up, so why not another one? Going from the Vishanti as a whole to one of its members, let's talk about Agamotto, specifically his most important item, the Eye of Agamotto. There's 2 key differences between the comics and the MCU's version. The first is that in the comics, the Eye has nothing to do with the Time Stone, and 2, there's 3 actually. So let's talk about the first thing. In the comics, the Eye, specifically the Eye of Knowledge, is used to do a bunch of different things, like teleportation, placing a person in suspended animation, and allows the user to see through illusions. So it's more like a generic magical item rather than just a time-related one, although the Eye can be used in a similar way to how Strange used it on the apple in his first movie, just without any relation to any Infinity Stone. For the second difference, it kinda speaks for itself. While it is possible that we could see one of the other 2 eyes, we've only ever gotten a mention of the third in the comics, so who knows what that would look like, and the second one acts more like a magical buff, so it's not the most compelling thing that they could do. When it comes to the villains that we've seen so far in Strange's Rogues Gallery, they're all pretty different, so let's quickly run through all of them that we've seen so far. Let's start with Kaecilius. So in the comics, instead of being Dormammu's henchman, he was Baron Mordo's henchman, who was actually Dormammu's henchman, so Kaecilius was third-rate at best. He just recently bit the dust in the comics, so just like in the MCU, he doesn't matter. Going up the chain of command comes Baron, my government name is Karl, Mordo. Now when it comes to human characters, Mordo is in the top of the top when it comes to Strange's villains. In the MCU, he's taken a different approach and seems to want to get rid of sorcerers entirely, but we have to wait until May 6th to actually know. Moving on to Dormammu, who for me is the Doctor Strange villain, so of course I was upset when instead of this, we got this. Now, Dormammu's got a long history going back to the 60s, so we're not going to go into his full history or powers, and since we only saw him for less than 5 total minutes, I'll just say they squandered him, and I am upset about it. Finally, another character that is being squandered, but this one makes a little bit more sense. So if you've seen the trailer for Multiverse of Madness, or MOM for short, then you've seen this guy who looks exactly like Shuma Gorath, but isn't. This, apparently, is Gargantos, a much less interesting tentacle monster who doesn't have any magical otherworldly powers. Now, reportedly, this change comes down to just name rights and tying into the broader MCU, since Gargantos has been in Namor comics and he's supposed to debut in Black Panther 2. Either way, this is Shuma Gorath, and if they do decide to put Nightmare in this movie too, since it seems like they're kinda teasing him, I hope they don't mess him up since they don't really have the best track record. Oh, and although she isn't a villain, Rachel McAdams' character, Christine Palmer, not being Night Nurse isn't a big change, but I know how people get when they think you missed something instead of just leaving it out because it's not actually important. kinda like her character in the movies. Finally, let's end on the most exciting thing I'm looking forward to in Mom, but before that, if you're like me and hate knowing anything about movies before they come out, here's your friendly warning. So the Illuminati was straight up confirmed to be in Marvel's latest magical adventure, but I can guarantee that it'll be different than any version of the group that we've seen in the comics so far. Now, in the comics, the Illuminati was a group started by Tony Stark that had the leaders of every major group of heroes, which he brought together to share info, specifically about the Kree Skrull War. So Tony was there to represent the Avengers, Doctor Strange because of his ties to magic, Black Bolt as the leader of the Inhumans, Professor X as the leader of the X-Men, Namor as the King of Atlantis, and Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four. There's also been a revolving cast of characters that take others' place, like Beast took over for Professor X for a time, but the OG lineup is the one that holds the most weight. Now, even though this is probably the most important group that's been formed in Marvel Comics, they only come around during massive events like the Incursions, which led to 2015's Secret Wars. Now, since this is going to be a multiversal version of the Illuminati, it's much harder to tell who's all going to be a part of the group. Professor X is definitely going to be a part of the group, or the trailer maker did some magic of their own with that voice line, but we could be seeing any other character filling in a role. It really just all depends on where Marvel wants to go in the future and who they want to set up in this movie. Fingers crossed for Multiverse Doctor Doom. While the characters and world around him are different, the core of Doctor Strange is the same. A guy with magical powers who usually makes more problems for himself and others because of those magical powers. Not saying he shouldn't be Sorcerer Supreme, but I know someone who could be better.